Welcome to Let's Talk Humanitarian, Parlons Humanitaire, enriching conversations with humanitarian workers and leaders to open eyes, heart, and mind. The program is developed by KALU Institute, your online humanitarian aid studies center, where humanitarians train humanitarians. My name is Amélie Yang-Griffes, and I'm very honored to be your host for this conversation today with Dominique Gassauer. Welcome, Dominique. Thank you very much for being here. Dominique, you currently work with OCHA, New York, with this hat that we're going to listen to you and to listen to what you have to share with us about civil military coordination, which is your area of your focus of work. And I wanted to share with our audience that actually I know Dominique for more than 10 years. I think we were blessed to work together in Sri Lanka in a tough context, but beautiful experience, beautiful projects, beautiful programs. And I've been always, since the beginning, really moved and touched by your humanitarian spirit, your commitment to the people in need. So that's really, I'm really excited to have you here on this program, because you have a lot to give and to share to us in terms of humanitarian aid and in terms of the development of humanitarian aid and its strengths today. Because you started working in humanitarian aid over 15 years ago, and it was in Darfur. So as I mentioned, you are the civil military focal point at OCHA New York right now. You've been working with OCHA since 2014 in Mali, in Chad as humanitarian affairs officer. Before joining OCHA, you've been working with a number of international organizations, also the European Union, ECHO, in emergency response, in headquarters and field-based positions across Africa and Asia. You hold a BA in politics with French, a master's in international relations and security studies, and a specialized master's in international public law. You're the mother of 2 gorgeous children, and you presently you're speaking from Brussels, no? You're working out of Brussels due to the pandemic situation. Is that right?
Exactly. Hi, Amélie. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm very excited to be speaking with you on this platform.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Dominique. Could you tell us a little? So, what is your work about? What is the civil military focal point job about?
Yeah, so as many of you might know or not, OCHA has a civil military coordination section, which is based in OCHA Geneva. OCHA has 2 headquarters, actually, one based in New York and the other based in Geneva. And CMCS, which is the acronym, is based in Geneva. And what the team found was that there was a need to reinforce the linkages within OCHA, between OCHA Geneva and OCHA New York, on matters concerning civil military coordination, and also to allow for partners outside of OCHA, that's within the United Nations system, other entities in the Secretariat, for example, like the Department for Peace Operations, to have a go-to person in New York who could rapidly respond to technical questions and just elaborate our collaboration together. So my job is really reinforcing the linkages within OCHA's different departments on civil military coordination, building those synergies, and also outside with third partners that are also working on civil military coordination issues.
Excellent.
So that's my
Thank
job.
you so much. Wow, exciting, and we're going to dive into to what exactly it entails. And I remember a number of years back, I remember hearing about CIMIC. So and now I understand the name is SIMCORD. So what has changed from CIMIC Times to SIMCORD, and what is the reason for this change of name?
Exactly. So it's actually a question of attribution of acronyms. So CIMIC used to refer to what we do now and what we commonly know as UN SIMCORD now, which is the ongoing dialogue between humanitarian partners and military actors in field of operations. And previously, indeed, this was what we referred to as CIMIC. But a few years ago, some of the key military allies in NATO came up with the term CIMIC to define their operations that were dealing with civilian interaction. And so we didn't feel it was appropriate to use the same language to denote two very different types of activities, because one is what we know as CIMIC today is really military parlance for engagement between military entities and civilian entities, be they the local population or other partners. So we had to come up with a different term just to make sure that we had a clear distinction to denominate what we were doing. So we came up with the term UN SIMCORD to really define the United Nations coordination capacity that OCHA provides in the field and at headquarters to engage actively with military entities. And the reason why we engage with militaries is very simple. Conflicts are becoming increasingly complex, they are of long duration, and we obviously often occupy the same space as military actors, be they national armed forces, international armed forces, non-state armed groups. And in this category, we also include peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, or peacekeepers from other entities. Even though the role of all of these different military actors is obviously quite different, we do feel that as a humanitarian community, we need to have a dialogue with all relevant stakeholders to make sure that we are able to access populations in need, and having that dialogue with military actors is key in accessing these populations.
Okay, excellent, and so interesting to know how, because we could think that the military and the humanitarian we saw much in different areas, no? And where is this meeting point that you see where the dialogue happens actually?
That's a very good question, and often in the trainings we provide, we start off with the different perceptions. You know, how do militaries view humanitarians and how do humanitarians view militaries? And in my own personal experience, these preconceived notions are often the result of myths and stories that we hear, preconceived notions also from our own personal histories that are often very wrong. And it's always important to come back to the individual and who we're trying to speak with and what we're trying to discuss with these people, and how dialogue is just indispensable for us as humanitarians, because at the end of the day, that is our only weapon, right? To speak to people, but not only to speak to people, but also to listen to our interlocutors and what their concerns are. So when we talk about military actors, for example, we do see a trend in international conflicts that show that military actors can have many different roles and many different objectives, and many different ways of operating as well in different conflict environments. So what OCHA does in areas where the humanitarian community as a general community of membership sees the value, we establish dedicated coordination mechanisms. And these are adapted to the field needs. So they can be held at the capital level, but also in the deep field level, where we have coordination hubs at the sub-regional level, for example. And the idea around these discussions is to invite humanitarians to discuss with military counterparts on how we operate on different issues that we might face together or separately as a result of one another. One example could be that if we have troops going out into the field, conducting their operations, and they observe that certain areas are not benefiting from humanitarian assistance, it is important that they also feed back to us so that we can understand why that might be the case, and basically improve our awareness of the situation and the situation of the affected populations that we are trying to reach. So information sharing is a key element of this dialogue. But the way that the dialogue is structured depends also on the context. And oftentimes when we're dealing with natural disasters or non-international armed conflicts, for example, the level of engagement with militaries will differ, because it's generally less politically sensitive to have close cooperation ties with military entities in a natural disaster setting, because militaries have a logistical capacity that we might find useful in our humanitarian response. And in a natural disaster setting, usually the politics do not really come into play, and militaries can more easily be perceived to be also neutral and impartial, especially UN peacekeeping forces, for example, who are by definition neutral and impartial. But in conflict settings, the perception of these forces is not always as neutral or impartial by the civilian population. So when we move into conflict settings, the engagement with military forces is more sensitive because the way in which these forces are being perceived. As humanitarians, as you well know, the humanitarian principles allow us to operate even in the most complicated areas because we are perceived as neutral, impartial, operationally independent. If we are seen as being too closely aligned with one party to the conflicts, or one military entity that might be perceived as a party to the conflict, that might compromise our ability to access populations in need in the short, medium, or long term.
Wow, so interesting. Thank you so much, Dominique. And would you say when we're able to have this dialogue, I mean, we're having it, with between humanitarian and military actors, what is the difference that we make in the lives of people? I mean, in the lives of the vulnerable people, the people why we are on the ground. What is the difference we can make in their lives through this dialogue?
Well, the impact is first of all that we can have an opportunity to communicate and help other actors who are working in the same environment as us understand who we are as a community, as a humanitarian aid community, what we do, what our objectives are, and how we do that. Because the how in humanitarian assistance is really what distinguishes us from other actors, even development actors. The fact that we are operationally independent, that we are pursuing humanitarian assistance to deliver that in an impartial manner based on needs. These are very delicate nuances that other actors in the field need to understand so that we can maintain our perception as being independent and neutral partners. The impact that we have is basically in terms of access and humanitarian access. When we have, for example, a convoy of humanitarian assistance leaving from A to B, in some countries, OCHA manages, for example, humanitarian notification systems. So this is a way in which we can notify the parties to the conflict that this convoy will be moving from A to B at a given time, and to make sure and recall the obligations of parties to the conflict of their obligations under international humanitarian law, which is that these are protected entities, be they moving convoys or stable sites. Unfortunately, of course, we see plenty of evidence around the world that it is not a perfect system. The protections under international humanitarian law that we are trying to reinforce with these tools are not always effective 100%, but they do help us create that dialogue and constantly reinforce the need of protected spaces and protecting civilians and aid workers in very, very hostile environments. So it is a key element to make sure that these principles and these concepts and the legal obligations are constantly being informed, because one can never take that for granted. And we do see that while many militaries do invest in that, and that is a positive trend that we are seeing, the awareness that soldiers and officers bring in terms of international humanitarian law is in many cases impressive. And people in those capacities and roles are very well aware of those responsibilities and take them very seriously. And they are also very eager to engage with us on, how they can improve that. So we also, as OCHA, conduct a lot of capacity building for military entities. We are part of training courses regularly for many types of armed forces at headquarter level or in the field, and also, of course, with the UN Department for Peace Operations, which manages the peacekeeping entities. Just yesterday, actually, we were giving a course on humanitarian assistance in the context of peacekeeping operations to future force commanders and deputy force commanders, which are the leadership in missions. So this is a way that we can constantly keep that message going and encourage a discussion. And the importance is not just speaking about these things, but also listening and understanding what problems they might be facing. When they're dealing with humanitarians, because there are still some humanitarian operators who feel very reticent about engaging too closely with the military, or they feel uncomfortable because they might lack the experience, they might have previous experience that might have not been so positive. So OCHA really serves a role there to help support that dialogue as a neutral interface. So often, times in the field, for example, if we're working in a context where perceptions are highly sensitive, we will organize dedicated meetings in OCHA offices where both parties, military or civilian, can meet in a safe space, and where there's no fear for these organizations to be perceived as having direct contact. Because if they were going to invite militaries to their offices and people are watching, that might be perceived as something a little uncomfortable, depending on who is watching, right? So OCHA offers that safe space of dialogue where we can exchange, where we can basically build these relations.
Thank you so much, Dominique, and it's really interesting and moving, because when this word coordination, it has lost a lot of its prestige because we use it so much for so many years, and we identify coordination with meetings that are useless, and where people have coffee and tea and discuss with no clear objective. And when I'm hearing about this civil military coordination, I hear it like it's actually a life-saving tool, because it enables the humanitarian actors to access people to access the aid and to accept the aid also, without putting their lives at risk, being identified by other parties like, oh no, you're going, it's so essential. So thank you for bringing this light to this topic. Do you have in mind like a success story of civil military coordination that you have seen in the field, a concrete example of some country that you would like to share with us?
Well, it's always sensitive to single out one country, so I'd rather take away the country. Exactly.
Phenomenal. Yes, thank you.
Well, I think one example that really comes to mind was in a recent mission of mine, where we were looking at the coordination structure. And just to emphasize and go back to your point on coordination, I mean, as a humanitarian practitioner, and OCHA will often be the organizer of many such coordination meetings, it is a difficult challenge, because we have so many reporting obligations, and humanitarian aid in itself is becoming increasingly complex, also by the sheer number of actors on the humanitarian side that claim to be humanitarian actors. So there are just a lot more people to coordinate, a lot more types of organizations to coordinate that are not necessarily interpreting the humanitarian principles in the same way. And this is one of the big differences between military operations and humanitarian operations. A military structure by country, or even in the UN peacekeeping operation, is a very unified hierarchical entity. So the officers, the rank and hierarchy are clearly defined, the roles and responsibilities, the mandate. So it's very clear on who you need to talk to get what decision made. On the humanitarian side, we're a very it's a very motley crew of different types of organizations with varying levels of capacity, of funding, and also the decision-making levels are very different. So actually, we realized in this one country where I was operating that there was a misunderstanding and an expectation gap in the decision-making capacity of humanitarian organizations. The militaries had a very clear delineated structure of command, and that was also decentralized at the field level. So there were relatively senior positions in field-based locations who were able to take certain decisions. And they were speaking at the tactical operational level with the coordination hubs in the field. On the humanitarian side, apart from a few UN agencies, the humanitarian NGOs did not have the same level of seniority and decision-making capacity in the field. That was really happening at the capital level in a very supportive way. And this is by all means not a criticism, it's just a reality in the organizational setup, right? So what we realized was that the people in the field on the military side were expecting a level of reactivity and decision-making that was not compatible with the reality of how the NGO decision-making structure was made. So how we tried to address this was by introducing another layer of coordination at the capital level, where the senior-most levels of command on the military side and the humanitarian side could meet and discuss strategic questions that were being fed up the system respectively from the field. And we organized these meetings on a quarterly basis. It was extremely successful, and it helped us make sure that we had the buy-in from the top level command and senior humanitarian leadership on strategic questions, and even adopting coordination tools like the humanitarian notification system that I mentioned earlier. It was important to understand first where was the problem and where was this expectation gap, because the military side was sometimes frustrated saying, yes, but we wanted to get this done quickly, and then the humanitarians take such a long time to get these decisions approved. And it was just because it was not clear that the decision-making level was not the same on the humanitarian and on the civilian side and on the military side.
Okay,
so that is one example.
Nice, very interesting to see all these challenges, no? that we're facing at different levels. And what if we want to deepen this question of civil military? What are the resources that you would recommend we read or we watch?
Well, we have, as the UN, as OCHA's Civil Military Coordination Service, we have an excellent website that's regularly updated with key documents and resources that are produced both by OCHA, but also partners who are working on this. And we also have some country examples of positive tools that have been used and tested. For example, we very much advocate for the adoption of country-specific SIMCORD guidelines or guidance in the fields where, again, humanitarian partners and military partners think this could help improve relations and the dialogue. And these country-specific guidelines are basically a framework that recalls what different roles are attributed to humanitarians, to the military functions, what are the areas where we can work together, and what are the underlying principles that basically define our collaboration or cooperation. So one example is, for example, the fact that any use of military or civil defense assets would only be used in a situation of last resort. The same goes for the use of armed escorts. They are absolutely only to be used when all other options have been exhausted. And these kinds of principles are just important to set down, because especially in UN peacekeeping operations, what we're seeing in a number of mandates of the missions that are in the field now, starting with MINUSMA, but also MINUSCA in the Central African Republic, is that part of the mandate also has an element linking the mission to humanitarian assistance. For MINUSMA, for example, one paragraph of the mandate actually specifies that MINUSMA has a mandate to help create a secure environment for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. What does that mean? How do we interpret that without compromising the humanitarian principles and humanitarian actors being perceived as neutral and impartial? So basically, as a complement to that, we have the country-specific guidelines that are being developed at the moment, and where we will also recall that, you know, while the use of armed escorts would help secure humanitarian assistance, that can only happen under very, very specific circumstances, when it is requested by the humanitarian community, and it cannot be imposed by any other actor.
Well, it's really interesting to hear that now the trend is having this specific, country-specific guidelines, because then it obliges stakeholders in the parties to sit together, discuss it, and contextualize it. No? Fantastic. So I guess OCHA provides a template.
We have a template, and all of that information is available in the recently published, well, it's not that recent, it came out in 2018, the new SINCORD handbook that was done by OCHA. It's also available in French, which is great news. And we're trying to make sure that our documents are available in as many languages as possible. And the handbook really is a very operationally oriented document that has lots of hyperlinks to good examples, good practices, and it's a very useful tool for anybody who's interested in it. And there you can also find some examples of country-specific guidelines. We have them in Haiti, for example, in South Sudan, in the DRC, and they're really, as you say, alone the process in reaching those agreements and defining those guidelines is already a very, very good, positively reinforcing experience, because it brings together the different actors, and it forces us all to hash out the differences, the nuances, and to make sure that we have a document that everybody can find themselves in. And also making sure that the dissemination happens, because oftentimes with these kinds of documents, you have a core team of drafters that are pushing it, then it gets adopted after a while, and then it sort of falls into oblivion. So the importance is also making sure that the dissemination and communication strategy that follows the adoption is equally invested in, to make sure that all of the necessary stakeholders have that knowledge. Because within the humanitarian community, you know very well that we have a high level of turnover for staff. So making sure that the institutional memory is preserved is extremely, extremely important.
Thank you so much, Dominique. We could stay hours talking about that. So fascinating, and I love hearing how we're progressing. Now we're progressing and starting really to make an important difference. So that's really encouraging. Thank you for sharing all that. And just as now we're going to finalize soon our conversation, I have two questions. Well, two sets of questions, I would say. First set, just one question to close the civil military discussion, coordination discussion. What would you say are the big perspectives now for the areas you're really focusing on for the next years? So I understand there's these guidelines. Is there anything else that you're focusing on in terms of civil military coordination?
Well, one of the trends that we're seeing in general is, and this has been going on for the last few years, is the expansion of member states' foreign policy toolbox, as they call it, to also include humanitarian aid in that. And I'm sure you'll remember the discussions we had within the European Commission. To what extent does humanitarian aid figure in this bigger toolbox? And now this conversation has moved from what we used to call LRRD, linking relief, rehabilitation, and development, and now we have this other term called nexus between the humanitarian development and peace actors, the HDP nexus. And this is a trend that we're really observing very closely, also from a civil military coordination perspective, because increasingly lines between aid in general and military interventions, especially by Western countries, is becoming increasingly blurred. And oftentimes, where there is a military intervention, there will also often be a funding, a pooled fund or a trust fund of some sort that helps fund assistance projects in the areas of interventions. We used to see that in Afghanistan and Iraq with the PRTs, provincial rehabilitation teams that used to take place there, where they would engage, military forces would engage in reconstruction efforts, building schools and hospitals. And we're still seeing this trend continue. And one of the elements that really comes back a lot with SimCord is the need to really distinguish humanitarian assistance from all of these types of activities and try to encourage member states to focus on more secondary or tertiary type assistance, be that infrastructure or just logistical assistance where it is necessary and where humanitarian assistance cannot reach certain affected areas. So I would say the first point is really, again, it's not new, but it's just repeating and trying to manage this trend of a fusion of the aid and defense objectives and security objectives. To give an example, for example, Barkhane has a development fund in its operational profile for certain parts of the areas that are in the theater of operations. And the funding of projects, while of course it is the prerogative of France to be able to do that, by having reinforced coordination, we can try to influence that process so that we can help, promote the humanitarian principles and ensure as much distinction as possible through that way. Another trend that we're of course watching very closely is the relations between humanitarian actors and non-state armed groups, which we also, for us, they fall under the umbrella of armed actors. And non-state armed groups, regardless of what their ideological or political imperatives are, they are still considered to be potential stakeholders and dialogue, partners of dialogue for us to access populations in need. And what we're observing very closely is to see where are the countries where we do have relatively good levels of engagement with such groups, and where is that a bit more problematic, and trying to explain the reasons for the areas where it is more difficult. And oftentimes it is a matter of perception that perhaps humanitarian actors are not entirely perceived to be entirely neutral and impartial. And then we as SimCord, we try to discuss with partners how can we engage in better understanding these dynamics and support partners in addressing those so that we can really access the populations in need.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for these insights. And now I would like to close civil military coordination chapter, because it's I mean, so much you've given us. We're going to go to the webpage and look for some more information. Thank you for giving us all of this. And to close our conversation and to say goodbye to you, I would like to ask two questions more about Dominique as a humanitarian worker. Have you ever dreamt of doing something else than humanitarian aid?
Well, two things come to mind immediately. I actually come from a very long-standing history of hoteliers. So my family had hotels and taverns until the Middle Age back in Austria. And I always had this little sort of side dream that if anything, I might possibly go back to that and open a little hotel of my own. I very much like welcoming people and hosting people and hearing from people and their experiences from all different horizons. And one little dream that I would have is to have a sort of guest house retreat where humanitarian workers, but also military folks or other people who might need a break from life for a while or come back from a difficult mission, have just some time to collect themselves and recharge their batteries. So that is one of the dreams. The other one would be to pursue more a career in law and to practice law as a lawyer. Those would be the two other sides. Yes.
Yeah, good, excellent. I love the idea of this guest house. I had goosebumps. Yes. Oh my God! I booked my room already. I booked my room.
Very good.
Yeah.
You'll have a standing room. There'll be the Amelie suite.
Thank you. I love that. And a question like to inspire. There are many of our audience. They are humanitarian workers who are studying to become a humanitarian workers or to upgrade the experience of humanitarian work. you have more than 15 years of experience in that field. Knowing all what you know now, would you be today to start your career, your humanitarian career, but with all what you know, is there anything different that you would do?
At one point, I for personal reasons, I had to start looking at having a bit more of a stable life, and moving around from emergency missions, deep field based, was becoming incompatible with the personal life. And this is a struggle that I think many of us face, between the professional aspirations and passions that we have, and then also the desire to have a family at some point. So that is a tension that I have been trying to resolve for the last 15 years, and it's still difficult. It doesn't get easier because you get an increasing number of opportunities the more experience you gather. And I think if I could do something a bit differently, it would be to stay a bit more longer in the deep field environment, because that is really what today drives me in my motivation in everything that I do. I hear the voices from the people that I've met, be they colleagues, be they beneficiaries, be they, you know, the local chiefs that we used to spend hours drinking tea with, negotiating, explaining, understanding, but also hearing, obviously, what they have been going through, what their challenges are in managing their communities in difficult times. And that is really what feeds my motivation to this day. And I wish I could have spent a little bit more time in those environments. But I'm thinking once my children are a bit older, I'll be able to go back there and possibly be more used, because I was very, very young when I was in those functions, and I had a lot to learn. And that really carries me until today.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for all this knowledge that you shared, this inspiration and this practical experience. That was truly an enriching conversation. So that's the end of this Let's Talk Humanitarian, Parlons Humanitaire with Dominique Gassauer, OCHA, New York. Thank you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.